Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we have arrived at part 4 of the braided cable series. And in this video we're taking you through probably the most advanced of the 4 projects, which are the mittens. So what I'm going to be showing you in this project is we're going to start off by joining in the round, and this project is again using magic loop. We're going to work a little bit of ribbing, and then we're going to introduce in the cable design where we're increasing for the thumb and then placing those thumb stitches on waste yarn. So I demonstrate again how you can read a cable chart for in the round knitting with increases. Then we work one more repeat of the cable pattern and we start our decreases. So the decreases should look familiar if you've previously worked our last tutorial, which was the braided cable hat. Up at the top of the mitten, we do a quick Kitchener stitch, then we come back over and we finish the thumb. All the details of this pattern, the gauge, the exact materials I used, are all available on my website for free, KnittingHouseSquare.com. So this one again is part 4 of the series. So I kind of tried to sort these in order of difficulty. We started off with the braided cable ear warmer. Then we had the braided cable cowl. So this one was our first in the round project. Then we moved on to the hat, where we introduced in the decreases at the top of the brim. And lastly, we have the mittens. I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and let's get started. First up for the materials for the project, what you need is first 2 different size knitting needles. So the ribbing of these mittens is knit on a US 7 knitting needle, and then the main fabric is knit on a US 8 knitting needle. And I'm going to be knitting using magic loop, so I just have 2 circular knitting needles with longer cords. That way it's easy to do the magic loop. You may want a stitch marker for marking the thumb stitches, so I have that just in case you'd like to use one. You're going to want a cable needle. I prefer the metal cable needles, so this is one of the Coco Knits metal cable needles. I'll link to some on Amazon down below as well. I have a tapestry needle, and I have my yarn. The yarn I'm using for this project is the same one I've been using for all of my woven cable designs. So for instance, here's the hat. I'm using the same yarn for all of it. This yarn is by Crow and Crescent Yarn Company, and I purchased this yarn off of Etsy. It is, here's the actual yarn label, it's a worsted weight yarn. So for something comparable, you're looking for a medium weight, worsted weight, or a number 4. And each one of these skeins of yarn has 218 yards. This colorway is Meridian. The yardage you're going to need to knit these mittens is 155 yards or 142 meters of worsted weight yarn. A few other things that can be helpful are a tape measure, if you have one of those available, pair of scissors, and then I also recommend printing out the cable charts and having those available with a highlighter. That when we get to the cabling portion of the mitten, it's easy to follow along with which round we're exactly on. For the initial cast on of these mittens, you're going to want to cast on a total of 40 stitches. And you can use any cast on method you'd like as long as it's stretchy. The method I'm going to be using is just the backward loop cast on, so a very simple cast on method. Other good options to use are the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. So first up, let's cast on our 40 stitches, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we can join in the round for magic loop to begin that initial ribbing. You're also going to be casting on to your smaller knitting needle size. So I'm casting on to my US 7. Once I have the 40 stitches cast on, I want to join in the round for magic loop. So I'm going to take all of those stitches and slide them over to the cord portion of my knitting needles. And now I'm going to count into the midway point. So I'm going to count 20 stitches in from either side. Once I find that midway point, I'm going to stretch out my work so that I can see the cord. I'm going to grab onto that cord, and then I'm going to fold my knitting needle and cord in half, and I'm going to begin sliding each half of those stitches up to each one of the 2 knitting needle points. I'm going to keep on going so that they're a little bit on each knitting needle. And now what I want to do is I want to position them so that my working yarn, or the yarn coming out of the ball of yarn, is coming out the knitting needle that's further away from me. So right now it's actually coming out the knitting needle closer to me. So I'm gonna flip them over. Now it's coming out the one further away. Both of my knitting needle points are going over towards the right. And the last thing I wanna do is I wanna make sure my work isn't twisted and that all of these cast on bumps are going down towards the table. Okay, so that looks good. All of those cast on bumps are going down, nothing looks twisted. So the way we work across one round in Magic Loop is we work across the first half of the stitches, then we turn our work and we work across the second half of the stitches. Once you've gone across both halves, that makes up one round. So how you want to have your yarn to begin a round depends on what the first stitch is. If you're beginning with a purl stitch, you could leave your yarn exactly where it is now, where it's hanging down below. I'm going to be beginning with a knit stitch. So what I want to do is I want to take my working yarn, I want to go up in between my two knitting needles and then just drape it over my back knitting needle. What placing it like that does is it helps prevent a yarn over at the beginning of your round. Now to start working, I need to take my back knitting needle, or the one further away from me, and I'm going to pull it towards the right so the back stitches end up on the cord, but I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. I don't pull it so much that you lose all of the cord over here. And now I'm going to take this free knitting needle that I have, and I'm just going to go right into the first stitch on my other knitting needle, and I'm going to begin the ribbing. So we're working knit one as our first stitch, and then we have to bring our yarn to the front in between those two knitting needles, and then we're working a purl one. So we're working knit one, purl one, repeating that all the way across this first knitting needle. Now when we finish going across the first knitting needle, we have to turn our work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my knitting needles so they're pointed over towards the right. And then I'm going to thread back in my second knitting needle point. And sometimes on the first round, this gets a little tight just because they're the initial cast on stitches. Great. Now, when you're setting up, you want to make sure, again, you have your two knitting needle points going towards the right. Your working yarn is coming out the back knitting needle, so the one further away. And all of your work is going down towards the table. Now I'm ready to work across the second half of the stitches for this first round. I just finished with the purl stitch, so now I'm going to be beginning with a knit. And whenever I begin with a knit, I need my working yarn to start off, coming up in between the two knitting needles and then draped over my back knitting needle. Now I'm going to take my back knitting needle, I'm going to pull it towards the right, so the back stitches end up on the cord. I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. And now I'm going to begin, again, continuing that repeat of the knit one, purl one, all the way across the second half of the stitches that we have here. Now that I've finished going across that second knitting needle, again, I'm going to turn my work so that my knitting needle points are going over towards the right. I'm going to thread back in my second knitting needle. And I'm all set up now to work the second round. So again, I just worked one round because I have to go across both knitting needles. So now for the next round, just double check that you're set up correctly. So if you're working yarn coming out the back knitting needle, all of your work going down towards the table and your knitting needle points going over towards the right. So I'm just going to continue working that same exact round where I do knit one, purl one, all the way across the front and back knitting needles until my work measures 2.5 inches. You can go longer or shorter if you'd like a longer or shorter cuff. For mine, again, I'm going to do 2.5 inches. Then we'll come back and we'll start working on increasing our knitting needle size first and then adding in that cable pattern. Quick reminder too, make sure you bring your working yarn up in between your two knitting needles and drape it over the back. I finished my cuff ribbing. So in front of me, what I have now is I have a copy of my printed cable chart. I have a highlighter, my other knitting needle size, and also my cable needle. Almost called it a tapestry needle. So looking at our chart first for a moment here, this chart is for in the round knitting. So how we're gonna knit this is we're gonna start at the bottom right corner of our chart, and we're gonna read from right over towards the left. And then for the next round, we're gonna go back over here to the beginning, read from the right over towards the left. This chart also only shows the front side of the mitten, so the first half of the stitches. Across the second half of the stitches, we'll always just be purling all the way across. This chart also just shows the first half of the stitches. So across the front, what we'll be doing, for the second half of the stitches, we'll always just be purling all the way across. So for instance, if we look at this first row, the color code of the boxes tells us whether or not we want to knit or purl. So this first row, it's a white box, that means knit, then a gray box, that means purl. So for this first row around where we're switching the knitting needle size, we're going to continue working the ribbing across the front, and then on the back, we're just going to purl all the way across. So how I can switch my knitting needle size is there's really two options. If you have interchangeable knitting needles, which is what I have here, you can just screw off the top and then switch them out. The other way you can do it is you can just pick up your new knitting needle and immediately start knitting with one of those two knitting needle points. So for instance, let's say I'm doing that second option. I'm still gonna take the back knitting needle and pull it off to the side. That just gives me a little bit more flexibility. But now I'm gonna go right into that first stitch with my completely separate circular knitting needle. That's now a US 8. And I'm gonna work knit, bring my yarn to the front and work purl. And I'm gonna work knit and purl all the way across this first half of the stitches. And you should have 20 stitches on either knitting needle back from when you originally set up your magic loop. When I finish going across the first half of the stitches on my new knitting needle, I'm gonna turn my work, and now my knitting needles look a little funny because I have two ones going right now. I'm gonna take my front stitches and my US 7 knitting needle, and I'm gonna thread it all the way over to the other knitting needle point. And now I'm gonna take my back knitting needle, which is my US 8 that I just started with, pull it towards the right, and I'm gonna begin working into these stitches going across. So I'm gonna purl all the way across all of these opposite sides, or the second halves of the stitches. Now when I finish there, I've now taken all of my stitches off of this US 7 knitting needle, so I'm just gonna put that to the side. And my stitches are fully on this new US 8 knitting needle. And I just worked across the first round of this cable chart where I switched the knitting needle size. So I'm gonna highlight across that row. Now when I look at the next row, which is labeled row 2, it starts off with 2 gray stitches. So that's telling me to purl 2. I'm gonna do 15 knit stitches. Then I'm gonna purl 2, make 1 purlwise, and then purl the final stitch. The main thing that's new in this row is that final box with an MP in it. So that's telling us we're gonna make 1 purlwise, and then we're gonna purl that final stitch. So we're creating 1 new stitch, and you'll notice that's why then when you go up to the next row, it doesn't just have the 20 stitches going across. Now because we made 1, it has 21 stitches going across. So I'm gonna work across row 2 now. So purl 2, knit 15, purl 2, make 1 purlwise, then purl the final stitch on the first half. And when you're starting off with a purl, you can leave your working yarn down below. You don't have to worry about bringing it over the back knitting needle. So I'm now gonna purl 2. And next up, I wanna make one purlwise. This can also be a great place to add your stitch marker because we're now beginning the thumb stitches. And we're gonna increase those thumb stitches. So I'm gonna place a stitch marker before I do that final make one purlwise and purl. So I have my stitch marker on there. And now to work a make one purlwise, I'm gonna stretch out my work so that I can see the bar connecting my previous stitch to my next stitch. I'm gonna pick up that bar using my left knitting needle, going from the back to the front underneath, and then I'm gonna purl into that bar. So make one purlwise, and then I'm gonna purl my final stitch. Now when I turn my work across the back side of my stitches, I'm just gonna purl all the way across. Now that I've finished row 2, I'm gonna highlight that one. If you wanna visually add to your chart too, where you just placed your stitch marker, we just placed our stitch marker right before where we made one purlwise. So our stitch marker will end up right here in our work. For row 3, we're again going to be working from right to left, and this one doesn't have any symbols in it. It just has the plain gray boxes and white boxes. So reading across this one, we would purl 2, knit 15, and then purl 4 across the front side. The back side, we're just going to purl. Row 4 is now we're going to begin inserting in our cables. So if we look across this row, the first 2 stitches are just purl stitches, but then we have 2 cable stitches. And the first thing you want to look at with the cable stitch is how many boxes does it take up. That tells you how many stitches are involved in the cable. So for this box, it takes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches. So it's a 6-stitch cable. And then to figure out how many stitches you want to put on your cable needle and whether to hold it in the back or the front, you look at the bottom right corner. So the bottom right corner here has a diagonal line coming out of it, and this diagonal line is going behind the other shape. So that's telling us we want to hold the cable needle in the back. And then how many boxes are there before the other shape starts? We have 1, 2, 3. So this is telling us to take 3 stitches, put them on the cable needle, and hold them in the back. Knit the next 3 stitches from the left-hand knitting needle, and then knit the 3 stitches that are being held on the cable needle. So if we look at that on our work, first, let me purl the first 2 stitches. Now I'm going to take those 3 stitches, put them on my cable needle, and I'm going to hold that cable needle in the back of my work because that diagonal goes behind the other shape. Then I'm going to knit the 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. Bring my yarn to the back there. And then knit the 3 stitches being held on my cable needle. So what we just did is we moved 3 stitches from the left over towards the right across the front. And that's exactly what you see in this pattern, right? There's 3 stitches coming from the left over towards the right in the front. Or you can think of it the other way. You took 3 stitches over from the right behind to the left. That's your diagonal back here. You took the first 3 stitches behind over towards the left. The next cable is going to be the exact same thing again. So we're going to take 3 stitches, hold them on our cable needle in the back of our work, knit 3 from our left-hand knitting needle, and then we're going to knit the 3 stitches that are on our cable needle. Now I just have 3 more white boxes, so I'm going to knit 3. Then I have 2 gray boxes, so I'm going to purl 2. And then if you're using a stitch marker, you'll reach the stitch marker So I'm just gonna pass that. And now I have 2 of the boxes that say make one purlwise. So first, to make one purlwise, I'm gonna stretch out my work, look for that topmost bar, and take my left knitting needle under that bar from the back to the front, and then I'm gonna purl right into that bar. Then I need to purl the stitch. So I turn the 1 stitch into 2 purl stitches, and then I have another one right after that. So I'm gonna stretch out my work again. I can see that topmost bar, pick it up from back to front, purl into that stitch, and then purl my final stitch. So now you'll notice that there's 2 new boxes on the next row, and that's because we increased 2 times. Now when I turn my work, I'm just gonna purl all the way across. Now when I look at rows 5, 6, and 7, there's no special symbols or extra increases in those rows. So I'm gonna work those real quick, fast forwarded off camera. Again, we're just gonna purl 2, knit 15, and then purl 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the end. Purl all the stitches on the other side, and we're gonna repeat that for rows 5, 6, and 7. Then I'll come back for row 8 here, where we're working a cable in the opposite direction, and we also have more increases. Now I'm up to row 8. So first I'm gonna work across to where my cable should go. So I'm gonna purl 2 and then knit 3. And now for this cable, again, it takes up 6 boxes total. So it's gonna be a 6-stitch cable. And I'm gonna look in the bottom right corner. So the bottom right corner takes up 3 boxes, the shape coming out of it. So I'm taking 3 stitches and I'm going in front over towards the left. So I'm gonna put 3 stitches on my cable needle and hold them in the front of my work. Then I need to knit the other 3 stitches that are on my left-hand knitting needle. And lastly, I'm going to knit the 3 stitches being held on my cable needle. So what did I do there? I took 3 stitches going from the right towards the left in front. So I took 3 stitches going from the right over towards the left in front. Or you can think about it the other way. I took 3 stitches behind going from the left to the right. So those are the stitches that ended up crossing across the back. I'm gonna work that exact same cable again. So I'm gonna put 3 stitches on a cable needle, hold it in front. Then I'm gonna knit the next 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. Knit the 3 stitches being held on my cable needle. Now I'm gonna purl 2, and then I'll be up to where my stitch marker is. Pass my stitch marker, and it says, make one purlwise. So just after my stitch marker, I'm gonna stretch out my work, go underneath that bar from the back to the front, purl into the bar. Then I need to purl 1 stitch. So all of that was that make one purlwise. Now I'm gonna purl 2. And now I have the make one purlwise again. So I'm gonna stretch out my work, pick up that bar, purl into it, and then purl the final stitch as part of that make one purlwise. So now, past my stitch marker, I'm gonna have 6 stitches total. Turn my work, and I'm gonna purl all the way across. Now, as I work up through the thumb, All the stitches on here are ones we've seen before. So we're gonna switch back over to the previous cable that we saw back there on row 4, and we'll still have our make one purlwise on the cable rows. There's also some extra make one purlwises on row 18, which is not a cable row. So I'm gonna work all the way up through row 18, and then I'm gonna come back and show you where I'm at for row 19, and I'm gonna show how I place these stitches on waste yarn, and I do one extra stitch with a backward loop cast on. Row 19 is where we're gonna work across, and then we're gonna place the stitches after the stitch marker on a piece of waste yarn to come back for later. So first, I'm gonna work in pattern here. So I'm gonna do purl 2, knit 15, and then I'm gonna purl 2. Now at this point, there's an arrow that spans across the next 12 stitches. So what I wanna do is I'm gonna take off my stitch marker because I don't need that anymore. And I'm gonna take a tapestry needle with a piece of waste yarn on the tapestry needle. So I just have a little bit of fingering weight yarn and my tapestry needle. I'm gonna go across these next 12 stitches and I'm just gonna slip them off of my knitting needle and onto the tapestry needle and waste yarn. Once it's on the waste yarn, I'm just gonna tie a little bow here to secure these stitches. And the last thing I wanna do is what this circle is representing. So this circle is telling me I need to do a backward loop cast on to cast on one more stitch here. So the way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna take my working yarn and I'm gonna put my left hand behind the working yarn, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers, and now I'm gonna take my pointer finger down below the strand, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. So I kind of have one full and then one half loop around my finger. And now I'm just gonna slip that topmost loop off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. So that added one more stitch. So now if you count across, you should be back to your original 20 stitches on your first half of over here. And then we didn't change anything on the back half of the stitches. So I'm just gonna purl across those 20 stitches real quick. Now turning my work, I'm gonna highlight across that row 19 real quick. What I wanna do now is I wanna work those exact same cable pattern again. So you'll notice there's this arrow going up and down here, and I wanna repeat these rows one more time. But the part I don't wanna add in this time is I don't actually wanna do the make one purlwises. So I'm only gonna be working the portion that's in this bold outer border. One more time. So for example, the next row I'm gonna work is down here at row 4. I'm gonna start from the bottom and go up again. So I'm gonna purl 2, then I'm gonna work both of my cables, knit 3, and then for these last 3 boxes here, I'm just gonna purl 3. So instead of working that make one purlwise, I'm just gonna purl that stitch. Next row, I would just purl 2, knit 15, and then purl 3. And I'm gonna continue going all the way up through rows 4 to 19 one more time. And then I'll come back and I'll show you the decreases up here at the top. Also for all these rows, you're gonna again just wanna be working purl stitches all the way across the back side. Now I've gone all the way through the additional cable repeat and I'm up to where my decreases are beginning. So for the decreases, you're gonna notice these are labeled with letters rather than numbers. If we look first at rounds A and B, these two actually don't have any decreases in them. These ones are just worked very similarly to down below in the chart. The first decrease doesn't begin until round C, and the way I can tell there's a decrease in this round is there's the box with this single diagonal line going through it. So I have a decrease over here, and then I also have a decrease on the opposite side of the cable pattern. Now you're going to notice that the round above that, round D, is missing a stitch, so there's just a dash just above where each one of those decreases were. The reason for that is these boxes with the diagonal line through them, we're getting rid of one of the stitches, so one of the stitches now no longer exists after we work each one of those repeats. So first up, I'm going to work rounds A and B, and then I'll come back and I'll show you the two decreases that we're going to be using in round C of our work. Now for round C, the main thing you want to pay attention to when you're looking at these decreases is which way does the diagonal line lean. So for example, this first decrease, the diagonal line starts at the right and it goes over towards the left. So we want to create a left leaning decrease. So what type of decrease would that be? That would be a slip slip knit. Then over here on the opposite side, we have a decrease that starts over at the left and goes towards the right. So we have to make a right leaning decrease. What type of decrease would that be? That would be a knit two together. So to start, we're going to purl the first two stitches. Then we have the left leaning decrease or the slip slip knit. So the way a slip slip knit works is you're going to pass the first stitch from your left knitting needle to your right knitting needle as if you're knitting it, but don't actually knit it. Then you're going to slip one more stitch from your left to your right knitting needle without actually knitting it. And now you want to take your left knitting needle point into the front base of both of those stitches, going from the left towards the right. So you're going through both of them at the exact same time. So now you have your left knitting needle in the front, your right knitting needle in the back, and now you can wrap your yarn around your back knitting needle and pull through. Then slip both of those stitches off of the left knitting needle. So we just created a left leaning decrease. So we're going to knit 11 across the center of this round. And now I'm going to be working my other decrease, the right leaning decrease, or a knit two together. So the way a knit two together works is I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the next two stitches on my left knitting needle knitwise, wrap my yarn around, pull through, and slip both of those stitches off of the left knitting needle. So now you can see it creates a right leaning decrease. Last step on this front side, I'm going to purl my final three. Now when I turn my work, the end of this row says decrease on the second half, so we also want to make sure we decrease 2 stitches on the back side of our work. Now this part isn't charted, but you're going to be working the exact same thing every time it says decrease on the second half. What you're going to want to work is you're going to want to purl the first stitch, then you're going to do a purl 2 together. A purl 2 together is where you take your right knitting needle into the next 2 stitches, purlwise at the same time, wrap your yarn around and push through, slide both of them off of your left knitting needle. So you just purled, turning 2 stitches into just 1. Then you're going to purl across until 3 stitches remain. Now you're going to purl 2 together again. And then you're going to purl the final stitch. So now on that decrease round, you worked the exact same number of decreases on the first half of your stitches where you did the slip slip knit and the knit 2 together, so 2 decreases, as you did on the second half of your work where you did a purl 2 together and then another purl 2 together. So now we've completed decrease round C. And when I look up at the next row around, so for round D, first I'm just going to purl 2. Then there's a little blank spot with dashes, so that stitch no longer exists. You're just going to skip right over to the next box. That stitch no longer exists because we decreased it. Now I'm going to knit 13 across the middle. I'm going to purl my final 3. When I turn my work for the second half, this one doesn't say anything about decreasing on the second half. So I'm just going to work purl stitches all the way across the second half. As you continue working up through the rest of these decrease rounds, a few other things I wanted to point out. So we've already gone through this one, which is our slip-slip knit. You'll notice round E though has one where it's grayed out with the line through it. So this box where it's grayed out with the diagonal line, that one is going to be a purl 2 together. So that's one of the decreases we've seen that we've previously worked on our purl side. Another thing to watch out for is these 2 cables in round E are different from each other. So you'll notice the size of this box that goes in front from right to left is different sizes between the 2. So the first cable you work, that's actually the same cable you've seen before, where you take 3 stitches, hold them in the front of your work, then work the next 3 stitches from your left knitting needle. But if you look at the second cable here, this box only actually takes up 5 stitches total rather than the regular 6. So what you're going to be doing instead is you're going to take 2 stitches on your cable needle and hold them in front, then work the next 3 stitches from your left knitting needle, then work the 2 stitches being held on your cable needle. The reason we have to modify this cable a little bit is because we've decreased some of the stitches, so there just aren't enough stitches left. So be careful when you're looking at that cable. The gray box with the line through it is a purl 2 together, and then all of these other decreases and cables you've seen before. So now I'm going to continue working all the way up through round K, and be sure that whenever you're decreasing on the front half of your work, you're also decreasing on the second half of your work. And once I finish round K, I'll come back and I'll show you real quick how I work the Kitchener stitch to close up the top of the mitten before we start the thumb. Before you begin the Kitchener stitch, just double check that you have the exact same number of stitches on each knitting needle. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 on each knitting needle, so that's perfect. I need a tapestry needle. Let's use this one. And I'm gonna cut my yarn, leaving a bit of extra here. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna cut it with about 18 inches or so. The way Kitchener stitch works is there's 2 setup stitches and then a 4-stitch repeat. The setup stitches are first, you're gonna take your tapestry needle, you're gonna go through the first stitch on your front knitting needle purlwise and just pull your yarn through. Don't slide anything off of the knitting needle. And then you're gonna go through your first stitch on your back knitting needle knitwise. Now we've set up. So for the 4-stitch repeat, I'm gonna show it twice, and then I'll just put the written steps up on the screen. That way you can always just pause the video and read through them as you continue across. First step, go through the first stitch on the front knitting needle knitwise. Slide that stitch off of the front knitting needle. Second step, go through the new first stitch on the front knitting needle purlwise. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle. Third step, go through the first stitch on the back knitting needle purlwise. slip that stitch off of the back knitting needle. Fourth step, go through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle knitwise. Leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. And every once in a while, I gently pull on my working yarn just to make sure it's tightening up as I go across. Showing the 4 steps one more time, I'm going to go through the first stitch on my front knitting needle knitwise, slip that stitch off of my front knitting needle. Step 2, go through the new first stitch on the front knitting needle purlwise, leave that stitch on the front knitting needle. Step 3, go through the first stitch on the back knitting needle purlwise, slip that stitch off of the back knitting needle. Step 4, go through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle knitwise, leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. So now I'll put the steps up on the screen and I'm going to continue working all the way across. Now at the end, you won't be able to do a full repeat. You'll just have 1 stitch on the front, 1 stitch on the back. So all I do here is I go through the first stitch on the front knitting needle knitwise, slip that one off, and then the first stitch on the back knitting needle purlwise, slip that one off. So I kind of just do steps 1 and 3. Now I've done the Kitchener stitch all the way across that top edge. So I'm going to take my waste yarn right here and I'm just going to thread it to the inside of the mitten. And later on, I'll go back through and I will weave in that end. Next up, we're going to work on the thumb. First thing we need to do for the thumb is pick up these stitches off of our waste yarn and put them back on our knitting needle. So I always start at the inner edge where the thumb meets the mitten. So no matter if you're doing this right mitten or if you're doing the left mitten, I would start at this inner corner and start picking up. So I'm going to pick up half of my 12 stitches. So I'm going to pick up 6 stitches. Then I'm going to pull those stitches over to my other knitting needle point, flip my work, and pick up the other half of my stitches now. Once I have all 12 stitches on the knitting needle, I pull out the waste yarn. Next up, I need to take my ball of yarn and I'm going to rejoin. So I'm just going to take about 8 inches or so and I'm going to thread it through the thumb hole to the inside of the mitten. And as if I'm beginning working around, I'm going to take my back knitting needle, pull it over towards the right. And before I actually start working the first stitch, I want to pick up 1 stitch from this inner corner. So I'm going to pick up something along this edge here. Let's go with that one right there. So I just picked up one of the loops from where that hole would kind of naturally form for a thumb. And what I want to do here is all my work is purlwise. So I'm going to take my working yarn in front and I'm going to purl the loop I just picked up with my first stitch together. Now I'm going to continue purling across this front knitting needle. So I still have 6 stitches total because I purled those first 2 together. Now I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to purl the first 5 here. I'm not going to work that 6th stitch yet. For a moment, I'm just going to pass it over to my right knitting needle because I need to pick up something else from this inner edge. So let's say I pick up Let's go with this one right here. I'm gonna pass that stitch again back over to my left knitting needle. So now I have my final stitch and the bar I just picked up from that opening. I'm gonna purl those two together. So I still have 6 stitches total. 6 stitches on either knitting needle or 12 stitches total. Now I'm gonna continue working round after round until this thumb measures 1.5 inches. And for each round of the 1.5 inches, I'm just purling all the way across the round. Now I've just gone up for that 1.5 inches, and one thing that you can check is you can check if that's long enough for you. So all I usually do is I lay my hand right on top of the mitten, right about where the thumb should fit, and I make sure that thumb is long enough. So for me, this will be perfect because there is plenty of stretch in the thumb, and I still have the decreased rounds I'm gonna add in. You can always go for more rounds though, or you can take out your rounds. If you want the thumb to be a little bit wider, nice thing about magic loop is you can always try it on. So if you wanted to add more space in your thumb, you could start off by when we pick up those extra stitches and work them together to close up that gap. Instead of working them together, you could just work them as additional stitches. So you could increase from the 12 stitches to the 14 by picking up the extra 2 on this inner corner. So 2 little customization ideas to think about there. Now next up, we're gonna start decreasing for the thumb, and the decreases are very simple. We're just gonna work purl 2 togethers all the way across the round. So we're gonna turn the 6 stitches on the front side, purl 2 together, each set of 2. So we're gonna turn the 6 down into 3. Turn our work and do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we have 6 stitches left. Once again, we're gonna work our final decrease round and we're gonna purl 2 together all the way across. So purl 2 together the first 2, then we'll have to move our 1 stitch so we can purl these 2 together and then purl 2 together the final 2. So we're turning the 6 down into 3. When I end up with the 1 stitch, that's easy to take care of. Just take your left knitting needle and pull on it so that stitch moves to the other side. Turn your work, and now you should have 4 stitches over here. Work that purl 2 together twice. Last up, I'm gonna take a tapestry needle, cut my yarn. Don't need a very long tail. I'm just gonna leave about 10 inches or so. Gonna thread the yarn tail through those final 3 stitches. And now thread that to the inside of my work, and I can weave in that end. Once you've knit both of the mittens, you're gonna go through and weave in all of the ends. So a few of them are pretty straightforward, right? The cast on one, I usually weave into the ribbing. The cast off, I weave in on the inside of my work. Again, here with the thumb, where we cast off, I weave in. And then I always put on the mitten and double check to see if there's any holes that are forming right here where the thumb meets the mitten. So I have one that may actually go away when I pull on my yarn tail. See if I can find the right yarn tail here. Should be a yarn tail for where I joined my yarn. Yeah, I have a yarn tail there, so I can use that yarn tail to close up any hole that starts forming in between the thumb and the mitten as I weave it in. So I'm gonna go through and weave in my ends, and then I'll come back and I'll show you my finished project. Thank you for joining me today as we created these braided cable mittens. Again, a quick reminder, this one was part of a 4-part series. So if you're interested in any of the other patterns, we have the ear warmer, we have the cowl, we have the hat. Be sure to check out all of those here on my YouTube channel or on my website, KnittingHouseSquare.com. As always, all of my patterns are free.